This episode examines a real, unresolved disappearance. It does not accuse individuals or speculate beyond documented facts. All information presented is based on publicly available records. This episode examines real cases and documented investigations. It does not assign guilt beyond established records. We're taught to believe that answers end uncertainty, that a final word, a definitive statement, brings a story to its rightful conclusion. In the world of justice, this belief is foundational. We seek the confession, the guilty plea, the verdict, milestones we trust to deliver clarity and close the door on doubt. That once someone confesses, the work is done. The case is closed. The truth, we assume, has been secured. But this case asks a quieter, more unsettling question. What if the answer arrives, not as a period at the end of a sentence, but as an ellipsis that stretches into infinity? What if the confession, the very thing meant to illuminate, instead casts a deeper, more confounding shadow? What happens when the answer you've been desperately searching for only makes the truth harder to find? To understand how such a paradox could occur, we have to go back. Back to a time before DNA profiling became a household term, before digital databases connected precincts in an instant. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement across the United States faced a problem that statistics couldn't soften. It was a crisis of volume, a relentless tide of violence that threatened to overwhelm the system. The social fabric felt frayed. A palpable sense of fear, amplified by nightly news reports, gripped communities. The specter of the random, motiveless killing, the stranger in the shadows, had become a national obsession. And behind the headlines, the reality for investigators was grim. Too many unsolved murders, too many cold case files gathering dust. Each pin on a map represented not just a victim, but a family suspended in the torment of the unknown, a community looking to the authorities for protection and resolution. There were too many families waiting, too little closure. The pressure was immense, coming from all sides. From the public, from the media, from politicians demanding results. Clearance rates, the percentage of crimes solved, became a critical metric, a public scorecard for police effectiveness. And the scores were not good. The system needed answers, quickly. Detectives worked against the clock, armed with little more than shoe leather, intuition, and burgeoning, often disconnected, criminal profiling techniques. Forensics was an analog science of fingerprints, blood types, and fiber analysis, powerful but slow and often inconclusive. Cases that crossed state lines became logistical nightmares of jurisdictional squabbles and incompatible filing systems. Information was siloed, trapped in metal cabinets in 1,000 different precincts. A detective in Texas might be hunting the same killer as a sheriff in Florida, and neither would ever know. The files piled up. The leads went cold, and the silence from the perpetrators was deafening. And then, into this pressurized void, came a voice. A man who said he could solve everything. He wasn't a suspect in a high-profile case. He wasn't caught red-handed. He was already in custody on a lesser charge when he began to talk. And once he started, he didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't resist. He confessed. First to one murder, then another, then a third. The initial confession was a breakthrough. The second, a shock. By the third, detectives were looking at a serial killer. But it didn't end there. He confessed to dozens, then hundreds. Word spread like wildfire through the teletype machines and phone lines that connected the nation's police departments. A detective in a quiet county, haunted by a single brutal murder from 5 years prior, would get a call. A task force in a major city, drowning in a dozen unsolved homicides, would receive a telex. The message was the same. We have a man in custody, and he says he's responsible for your case. He claimed a staggering geography of violence, a trail of bodies that crisscrossed the country. From the sun-bleached highways of California to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, from the plains of the Midwest to the swamps of the Gulf Coast. He offered up names, locations, and methods. For departments starved of leads, it was like a dam breaking. Jurisdictions listened because they had to. Because the alternative was the continued silence, the open case file, the grieving family without an answer. They listened because this one man offered a solution to their most intractable problems. He was the key, the missing piece, the answer they had been praying for. Finally, the silence broke, and in its place was a voice, recorded on hours of magnetic tape, a voice that promised to give them everything they wanted. A confession is powerful. In the complex machinery of justice, it acts as a master key. It doesn't just unlock a single door. It has the power to bring the entire sprawling process to a sudden, decisive halt. It transforms the chaotic fog of uncertainty into a clear, linear narrative. It converts immense, often frustrating effort into a measurable, reportable outcome. For investigators facing mounting pressure, a confession is more than just a breakthrough. It's a release valve. The long hours, the dead ends, the gnawing ambiguity, all of it can be swept away by a few signed pages. With a confession in hand, cases close. The statistical ledger, a constant source of administrative scrutiny, improves. Clearance rates, the primary metric of a department's success, tick upward. And perhaps, most importantly, families who have been suspended in the torment of not knowing are told there is, at last, an answer. And the system exhales. A collective sigh of relief ripples from the squad room to the district attorney's office to City Hall. The machine for a moment can rest. This is the seductive appeal of the confession. It offers closure not just for a single case, but for the institution itself. It represents order restored, a problem solved and filed away. But what happens when the answer arrives too easily? When the story it tells is just a little too neat? This is where the details begin to matter. In the initial stages of an investigation, every detail is a potential breadcrumb, a lead to be followed. But after a confession, their function changes. Dates, locations, specifics. These elements are no longer clues to be discovered. They become facts to be confirmed, boxes to be checked. The goal is no longer to find the story, but to make the confession fit the story that is already believed to be true. But in many interviews, especially those conducted before mandatory recording policies, these crucial details aren't verified independently. They aren't offered spontaneously by a suspect recalling a memory. Instead, they are often introduced, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, by the investigators themselves. They're prompted, clarified. Sometimes they are corrected. Are you sure it was a Tuesday? Because we know the victim was last seen on Wednesday. You said you left through the back door, but the back door was bolted from the inside. Maybe you went out the window? This is known as contamination. Information that only the true perpetrator could know is fed to the suspect, who, under immense pressure and fatigue, may incorporate it into their statement. This isn't necessarily malicious. It's not the act of a rogue officer fabricating a story from whole cloth. It's procedural. It stems from a deeply ingrained belief system within investigative culture. The interrogator's job is to get the truth from a subject they already believe is guilty. The process is designed to overcome deception, not to test for innocence. The questions are tools to confirm a pre-existing hypothesis. Once a confession is obtained that fits the general framework of the case, a powerful psychological phenomenon takes hold: confirmation bias. The scrutiny softens. The intense, critical lens that was once applied to every piece of information is now turned off. The focus shifts from investigation to prosecution. The objective is no longer to question the answer, but to defend it. In this new reality, contradictions in the confessor's story become simple memory lapses. Physical impossibilities, like being in two places at once, are smoothed over as confusion. Evidence that doesn't fit the narrative is deemed irrelevant or coincidental. The confession becomes an anchor, and any evidence that doesn't tether to it is allowed to drift away. The explanation is already here. It's signed, it's documented, and it makes sense of the senseless. So why keep questioning it? To do so would be to reopen the wound, to undo the progress, to admit the comforting certainty was an illusion. It would mean telling your superiors the clearance stat needs to be reversed. It would mean facing the victim's family and telling them you were wrong. It is easier and more efficient to believe. This belief has a profound, cascading effect on the entire investigation. The search for truth narrows into a search for corroboration. In this context, speed can feel compassionate. It feels like resolution for the victims and efficiency for the public. But this speed has a cost, one that is often invisible until it's too late. Alternative suspects, who may have been persons of interest just days before, are officially cleared and stop being pursued. Alibis that were once considered shaky are now accepted without further verification. The investigative resources are reallocated. Physical evidence that was queued for forensic analysis is withdrawn. The search for corroboration narrows until it includes only the evidence that supports the confession. Because the answer has already arrived. The lab sits idle. The phone lines that were once ringing with tips go quiet. The real perpetrator, if they are still out there, is given the most valuable gift imaginable: time. And the system, confident in its conclusion, moves on. In the architecture of an investigation, a confession is meant to be the keystone, the final piece that locks everything else into place, lending strength and stability to the entire structure. For a time, it seemed to be just that. The files were closed, the statistics improved, and a sense of order was restored. But structures built on faulty foundations are destined to fail. Over time, cracks appear. Not all at once, but in subtle, unsettling ways. A hairline fracture here, a slight settling there. It begins with a single file, reopened for an unrelated administrative review. An investigator, perhaps a new detective or a meticulous clerk in the records department, notices an anomaly. A date that doesn't quite fit. Confessions don't match records. The confessor claimed to be in Texas on a Tuesday, but a gas receipt places his vehicle in Florida a day earlier. An impossible journey. Travel timelines don't align. He described using a specific weapon, but the coroner's report, filed away and forgotten, details a different caliber entirely. Independent evidence contradicts statements. Each contradiction is a loose thread. At first, it's tempting to snip it off, to dismiss it as a clerical error or a misremembered detail. But curiosity, once sparked, is a difficult thing to extinguish. You pull the thread, gently at first, and then with growing urgency. And the answers that felt so complete, so final, begin to unravel. The entire tapestry of certainty comes apart, revealing the chaotic, unresolved reality it was designed to conceal. The evidence board, once a monument to a solved case, is reconsidered. It transforms from a map of the truth into a diagram of delusion. The lines of string connecting suspect to victim now seem arbitrary, forced. The central photograph of the confessor, once the face of guilt, now becomes a question mark. What was once a process of confirmation becomes a painful process of deconstruction. Every piece of evidence must be reevaluated, not as proof of the confession, but on its own merits. In the digital age, this unraveling is even more stark. Timestamps on digital files contradict sworn testimony. Location data from a cell phone, once ignored because the case was closed, now screams of an impossible alibi. The digital breadcrumbs don't lie. They offer a silent, objective rebuttal to the accepted narrative. The clock is not just a metaphor, its digital record becomes a primary witness, and its testimony is damning. The forward momentum of the original investigation, that relentless ticking of the clock toward a resolution, stalls. It reverses. Investigators are now forced to travel back in time, not just in memory, but through mountains of paperwork, re-examining what was dismissed and searching for what was never sought. The ticking clock of justice is replaced by the sound of a mechanism grinding to a halt, burdened by the weight of a truth that was prematurely buried. And in the quiet of that archive, surrounded by the ghosts of abandoned leads, here is the realization. The true poison of a false confession isn't just that it convicts an innocent person or lets a guilty one walk free. That is the immediate, obvious tragedy. But the deeper, more insidious damage is systemic. The greatest damage wasn't that some confessions were false. It was the institutional sigh of relief that followed them. It was the sound of hundreds of files being stamped closed. It's that they ended curiosity. A confession provides an answer, and in a system under pressure, an answer is a stopping point. It's a signal to cease all other lines of inquiry. The phone call that was never followed up on, the witness who was never re-interviewed, the forensic evidence that was never sent to the lab because a suspect was already in custody, these are the invisible casualties. They replaced investigation with acceptance. The dynamic, uncertain, and often frustrating process of seeking truth was substituted with the static, passive act of administration. The goal shifted from solving a crime to clearing a case. And while those may sound the same, they are fundamentally different. One is a mission, the other is a metric. And once a system stops asking questions, the path back to the truth becomes exponentially more difficult. Evidence degrades, witnesses move, or forget, or pass away. The trail grows colder not by the day, but by the year. The false answer acts as a layer of asphalt poured over the crime scene. Recovering the truth becomes harder than if no answer had ever arrived at all, because now you must first break through the hardened certainty that was built on top of it. The silence in these archives is deceptive. It is not the silence of resolution, but of neglect. Each box represents a story put on pause, a family left with a fiction, and a perpetrator who was free to continue. The resources that should have been pursuing them were instead diverted to processing the paperwork of a lie. Lab technicians, already facing backlogs, were told to stand down. Detectives were reassigned. The entire machinery of justice was redirected down a dead-end street. Eventually, the system begins to correct itself, but the process is slow and painful. It comes in the form of addenda and retractions. These are not just bureaucratic updates. They are admissions of a profound failure. Each retraction is a formal acknowledgement that the comfort of a prior answer was an illusion. For some departments, this led to reforms. New protocols for verifying confessions, mandatory recording of interrogations, and specialized cold case units designed to look back with fresh eyes. But these reforms were born from the wreckage of lives already altered. For some families, the answer they were given, the name and face of the person they were told was responsible for their loss, was later withdrawn. They were forced to return to the agonizing uncertainty of unknown, a wound reopened after it had been forcibly scarred over. They had mourned, perhaps even forgiven, a person who had nothing to do with their tragedy. The closure they were promised was a mirage. For others, the answer remains, unproven, but final. Their case file sits in an archive, marked solved by a confession that is now known to be part of a pattern of falsehoods, but without the specific evidence to officially overturn it. They are left in a state of permanent limbo, holding an answer they cannot trust, but are not allowed to discard. The harm is quiet. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and headlines. It's a silent, corrosive force. It lives in the cases that will never be reopened, because on paper, they were already solved. It lives in the statistical reports that celebrate high clearance rates, blind to the hollow nature of those numbers. And it lives in the public consciousness, which has been taught to see a confession as the infallible end of the story, rather than just one chapter within it. We are conditioned to seek resolution, in stories, in puzzles, and most of all, in justice. We believe answers are the goal, the destination we are striving for. This case teaches something colder, more complicated. It suggests that the process is more important than the answer. That the relentless act of questioning, of remaining curious and skeptical, is the true engine of justice. Because when we prioritize the answer over the process, we risk accepting any answer that fits. We create a market for convenient truths. And some answers don't reveal the truth. They are a shield against it. They are a lock on a door that should have been left open. They bury it. This is Armchair Files. And this was File 015. The search for truth is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires stamina, patience, and a willingness to admit when the path you're on is wrong. It demands that we value the difficult question over the easy answer. If this episode made you question the comfort of certainty, share it with someone who trusts confessions too easily. The conversation itself is a form of investigation. By questioning what we accept as final, we keep the door to the truth from being locked forever.